Tonight, we stay up late with Alan Godfrey, a Yorkshire constable who drove the same valley roads for years, until one November morning, a shape stood over the road ahead. His radio went dead in his hand, and 20 minutes of his life went missing and never came back. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. The Calder Valley cuts through the Pennines in the west of Yorkshire, a deep and narrow trough with the moor standing over it on both sides. The road follows the river along the bottom, past mills and dark stone terraces, past dry stone walls that climb the hillsides in a grid older than anyone living. In the early hours, the mist settles into the bottom of the valley and does not lift, and the towns along it, Hebden Bridge, Mytholmroyd, Todmorden at the western end, go quiet in the way that only steep places go quiet, with the hills holding the silence in. It is a beautiful part of the country, and a closed-in one. A person can live a whole life in a valley like that and feel they know every bend of it. Alan Godfrey did know every bend of it. He was a constable in Todmorden at the end of the 1970s, a working policeman in a small mill town, and the town and the roads around it were his to walk and drive on the long night shifts. He was not a man with any particular interest in the strange. He had joined the police to do an ordinary and useful job, and he did it. The calls about the pubs at closing, the break-ins, the stray livestock on the roads, the small troubles of a small town in the dark. His trade was the plain one of writing things down. Who and what and where and when in a notebook, in a hand a court could read later. A good constable is a reliable witness, and Godfrey was a good constable. He carried, as they all did, a personal radio, the handset that tied a man on a dark road to the station and the rest of the shift. It was the tether. On a night with mist in the valley and no one else about, that handset was the proof that the ordinary world was still there and still listening, a click and a voice away. A policeman trusts it as he trusts the ground. So that is the whole of it, at the start. A steep old valley with the mist in the bottom of it, a steady man who knew the roads, a notebook for writing down what happened, and a radio for calling it in. Nothing in that arrangement suggested there would ever be a night the notebook could not hold, or a morning the radio would not answer. The first strange thing came in the summer, and it came to Godfrey in the plainest possible form. A body where no body should have been. In June of 1980, on a Sunday morning, a coal delivery man climbed the tip at a yard in Todmorden and found a dead man lying near the top of the coal. The dead man was Zygmunt Adamski, a Polish miner in his late 50s. He had lived for decades in a town called Tingley, over on the far side of the moors, better than 20 miles to the east. That distance is the first thing to sit with before any of the rest of it. 20 miles. He had left his home 5 days earlier to walk to the shops for potatoes in his shirt sleeves on a summer afternoon, and he had not come back. For 5 days, no one knew where he was. Then he was here, on the coal in Todmorden, in a town he had no reason to visit and may never have seen in his life. And he was not quite dressed as himself. His shoes were gone, and his shirt. Someone, at some point in those 5 missing days, appeared to have stripped his outer clothes and put him back into a set that was partly not his own, and to have given him a rough, clumsy shave. A man walks out for potatoes and comes back 5 days later dead, 20 miles from home, in clothes that are not entirely his, shaved by a hand that was not his own. Godfrey was among the officers called to the yard. What went into the file was this. Zygmunt Adamski, aged 56, of Tingley, missing 5 days, found dead on the 11th of June 1980 on a coal tip in Todmorden, more than 20 miles from home. Cause of death recorded as heart failure. And then the detail the file could not dispose of. On the back of his neck and the crown of his head were burns, not fresh, judged to be a day or two old at the time he died. Over the burns, someone had smeared an ointment. Samples went to a home office laboratory, and the laboratory could not say what it was. The coroner, in the end, could not say how Adamski came to be where he lay, or who had tended those burns, or what the salve was, and recorded an open verdict. An open verdict is the law's honest shrug, the finding a careful system reaches when the evidence runs out before the answer does, a way of writing down that a thing happened and cannot be explained, and closing the folder without pretending otherwise. There was no sign of violence beyond the burns, no clear cause, no account that fit all the facts at once. Godfrey filed his part of it and went back on shift. The Adamski case belonged to other men and other departments, and over the following weeks it settled into the drawer where a police force keeps the things it cannot close, not forgotten exactly, but set down. A strange summer death in a mill town. New reports came in and pushed the old ones back. Fresh pages filled in the notebooks. The Adamski file moved further into the cabinet, behind the more recent trouble of a working town. 5 months later, in the last dark week of November, Godfrey was on the night shift again, out on Burnley Road at the edge of town, looking for something entirely commonplace. It was the 28th of November, 1980, and it was nearly the end of the shift. 5 in the morning is its own country. The town was asleep and the valley dark, and the mist had settled into the bottom of it as it did on cold nights, so that the few street lamps stood in soft rings. Inside the car it was warm and close, the heater ticking over, the engine idling low. Condensation crept up the inside of the windscreen, and Godfrey wiped a patch of it clear with the back of a glove. The dashboard laid its faint green glow across his hands. The set on the dash muttered its small night sounds, the traffic of a sleeping town. It was the hour when a shift stops being work and becomes only waiting. The last hour, the cold and empty one, when the body wants its bed and the mind runs a little loose. He was out on Burnley Road, the road that runs toward the edge of Todmorden, and he was there for a dull reason. The accounts differ a little on which dull reason, whether it was cattle reported loose on a housing estate or a check for stolen vehicles, and it hardly matters because it was the kind of small routine errand that fills the last hour of a night shift everywhere. He was tired and wanting the end of it, driving a stretch of road he had covered 100 times. There was nothing to the start of it, no dramatic doorway, only a police car, a familiar road, a cold morning, a man near the end of his work. Godfrey said so himself afterward again and again, that he had not been thinking of anything out of the way, that he had no interest in flying saucers, that he was only finishing his rounds and wanting his bed. Then there was something on the road ahead. At first he barely took it for a problem at all. A vehicle stopped where a vehicle should not be. Someone parked badly at the edge of town. As he came on, the shape grew into something larger, and his tired mind reached for the next familiar answer. A bus, an early works bus, halted on the carriageway. But it was too early for the bus, and the bus did not run that stretch at that hour, and the shape was the wrong shape for a bus. The everyday answers came up one after another, and each fell away as he closed the distance until there were none left and he was looking at the thing itself. It stood above the road. Broad and, as he later described it, diamond-shaped, wider than the carriageway, it hung a few feet above the surface with its lower half seeming to turn. This was not a bus, and not anything he had a word for, sitting there in the mist in the last dark of the morning, filling the road he knew every bend of. And Godfrey did the thing his training told him to do with anything unusual on his patch. He reached for the radio to call it in. He picked up the handset to report the object, and the radio would not work. Both of his radios would not work, the personal set and the car's. He tried to raise the station, and there was nothing, not static and not a voice, only the dead weight of a thing that had always worked before and now did not. The tether to the ordinary world, the click and a voice that had made every empty road survivable, was simply gone. He was alone on Burnley Road, with a shape hanging over the carriageway, and no way to tell anyone that he was. It is worth stating the bare record once plainly, as a duty officer would enter it. On the 28th of November, 1980, at about 5 in the morning, Police Constable Alan Godfrey was on duty in Todmorden, in the Calder Valley of West Yorkshire, driving a familiar stretch of Burnley Road at the edge of town. Ahead of him, above the road, stood a broad, diamond-shaped object, wider than the carriageway, its lower section appearing to rotate, hanging a few feet above the surface. He attempted to report it by radio, and neither of his radios would function. The next thing he was aware of, he was farther along the road, still driving, with a period of time he could not account for, something on the order of 20 minutes gone from the night. His left boot was split. That is the record as it was filed. Everything else came later, because the next thing he knew, he was driving again. There had been the shape over the road and the dead radio in his hand, and then, with no seam he could feel, no sense of a gap as it happened, he was farther down Burnley Road, the car moving under him, the road ahead empty, the object gone. He had passed it somehow. He was simply driving on the far side of it, as though the intervening minutes had been lifted cleanly out of the night and the two cut ends pressed back together. He stopped the car and got out, there on the cold road in the dark, and did what a trained man does. He tried to make it make sense. Behind him, the road ran back empty to the place where the thing had been. On the surface, roughly where the object had stood, was a patch left dry where the wet of the morning had not settled. And one of his boots, he saw, had split across the sole, as though it had been dragged, though he could not say how. Then he got back in the car and drove to the station, and found that more of the night was missing than a few dark minutes on an empty road should have taken. Back at the station, in the light, the night would not add up. He had the clock, and he had his own notebook, and the two would not agree. The object he had left behind him on Burnley Road at a time he could fix. He had come to himself, still driving only a short way on, yards on, a stretch he could have walked in a couple of minutes. The clock said otherwise. The clock said that the better part of half an hour had gone by in that short distance. Godfrey did the arithmetic once, standing there, and did not believe it, and did it again. He looked at the duty sergeant. Near enough 20 minutes, and no account he could give of them. 20 minutes he had been somewhere doing something and could not produce. At some point, without deciding to, he opened the notebook to write it down. The hand did it on its own, the habit of years, pen to the page, the next line waiting. And there was nothing to put there. The plain record that had held every strange and everyday night of his working life had no line for this one. The radio had gone dead out on the road. Now the page stayed empty at the desk. The instrument that reached the world outside and the one that kept it inside, both failing him within the same half hour. There was no chase in it, no terror, no light bearing down, only a gap. A man whose whole trade was remembering exactly what happened and setting it down in a hand a court could read, had a piece of his own night he could not remember and could not fill. He knew it was gone and could do nothing about it. He went home with the split boot and the missing minutes and the memory of a dry patch on a wet road, and none of it would resolve into anything he could set down. There were the small things of the body too, and he noted them the way he noted everything: the split boot, a patch of soreness on one foot, discrepancies that matched nothing and proved nothing, but that were there and that he had not carried at the start of the shift. The following year, still reaching for the gap, Godfrey agreed to be hypnotized. Under hypnosis, he described more: a room, a light, a tall, bearded figure he came to call Yosef, smaller shapes moving about, something that read like an examination. It is the sort of material to hold at arm's length. Memory recovered under hypnosis is not the same as memory, and Godfrey himself was never easy about it and never insisted on it. It does not have to be believed, and it will not be settled here, because the strange thing does not actually live in the room with the bearded figure. The strange thing had already happened, out on the road, before anyone was hypnotized, before there was any story of a room at all. What remains, when every later thing is set aside, is what was filed that same morning by a sober man on duty: the radios that would not work, the object over the carriageway, the 20 minutes simply gone, the split boot, the dry patch on the wet road. He sat down, in the end, to write his report, the plain account, who and what and where and when, and filed everything he could stand behind. What he couldn't file was the part in the middle, the 20 minutes themselves, as far out of reach at the desk as they had been out on the road. Afterward, he still had to drive the road. That is the part that is easy to walk past, and it is the truest part. Burnley Road did not close or change or mark the spot. It was still his patch, still the way to the edge of town, still a stretch of everyday carriageway he was expected to drive on the shifts that came after. And he drove it. A man who had lost 20 minutes on that road went back to work and passed the place again and again, in daylight and in the dark, with the mist down in the valley bottom as it always was, and nothing ever happened there again. The walls still stood, the river still ran, and the bend was only a bend. What it cost him is its own long story, and most of it is quiet. He had reported the thing honestly, the way a good constable reports everything, and the report followed him. Some believed him and some did not, and a man who has seen something he cannot explain and who will not pretend he did not becomes a slightly awkward thing for the world around him to hold. In time, he left the police. He carried the 28th of November with him for the rest of his life and told it, when he told it, plainly, without ever growing it in the telling or reaching for the word that would have made it more than it was. He never got the minutes back. That is the ending, if an open story has an ending. Not a craft explained, not a room proved or disproved, not a verdict. Only a man with a gap in one night that never filled, and a notebook with a stretch he could not write. A few miles off, and a few months before, there had been the man on the coal. People have tried ever since to make the two into a single story: the death in June And the encounter in November, the burns no one could explain and the minutes no one could account for, laid down in the same small valley within half a year. Perhaps they belong together. Perhaps they only share a place in memory and a constable who happened to stand over both. No one has ever shown a thread running from the one to the other. They sit side by side, the way two unexplained things can sit side by side in the same few miles, and refuse the pair of them to close. And the radio. Go back to the radio, the plain black handset that ties a man on a dark road to the rest of the world. That is the object to hold on to more than the shape over the carriageway, because everyone has raised a phone or a receiver and heard the line go dead and felt for one small moment the ordinary world stop answering. That is all it was, at the center of it. A policeman raised his radio to call in something strange, and the world did not pick up. So let the road be the last of it. Tomorrow someone else will drive that stretch of Burnley Road and nothing will happen. The mist will be down in the valley bottom the way it always is. The stone walls will stand where they have stood for longer than anyone can say. And somewhere between two familiar bends, on a cold morning in the last week of November, a careful man who only ever wanted to write down exactly what he saw lost 20 minutes he never found again, and drove the road ever after as though it were still only a road. Tonight we stay up late with Lonnie Zamora, a practical New Mexico police officer who heard a roar one spring evening and drove down into an arroyo to see who might need help, and found a white egg-shaped craft resting on the desert floor with two small figures in white standing beside it. He spent the rest of his life insisting, quietly, that he had told it exactly as it happened. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. The country around Socorro, New Mexico is high desert, an old mining and college town down along the Rio Grande, with low volcanic hills and pale mesas opening out to the south, cut here and there by arroyos, the dry gullies that carry water only when it comes rarely and hard. In the late afternoon, the light comes in low and gold off the greasewood, and the whole place holds a particular quiet, a land that has watched a great many things happen on it and kept its opinion to itself. On the evening of the 24th of April, 1964, a town police officer was driving through that country chasing a speeding car. His name was Lonnie Zamora, a Socorro policeman. A local man respected in the plain way a steady officer is, not given to tall tales with no particular interest in flying saucers or the like. His trade was the ordinary, useful one of patrolling a small town on the long shifts, and he was good at it. On this evening, he was doing the most routine thing a patrolman does, running down a car that had gone past him too fast, when two things happened at once, off to the southwest. He heard a roar and saw a flame come down out of the sky. There was a dynamite shack out that way, a shed where explosives were kept for the work around town, and Zamora's first thought was the sensible one. It had gone up. That is worth holding on to because it tells you who he was before any of the rest of it. A man who heard a roar and saw a flame and thought not of visitors from elsewhere but of an accident and whoever might be caught in it. He let the speeder go. A man who might be hurt came before a traffic ticket and turned off onto a rough gravel track that climbed and then dropped toward the arroyo. The track was bad and steep, and it took him a moment to get the car over the last rise. When he came over it, there was something down in the gully ahead. At first he took it for a car, an overturned white car standing up on one end on its radiator or its trunk, the way a wreck comes to rest. It was pale against the mesa behind it, whitish like aluminum, though not the bright of chrome. His mind was already halfway to the story that fit. A bad crash, someone to pull out. And then, near the pale shape on the ground, he saw the two figures. They were small and in white coveralls, the sort of thing a man wears to work at something. They were, he said afterward, normal enough in their shape, though possibly they were small adults or large children. He could not be sure, and to his lasting credit, he never once pretended to be. One of them seemed to give a start, as though it had caught sight of the car up on the rise, or of him. Everything in that first moment still belonged to the ordinary world. A stalled vehicle, people beside it, a policeman coming to help. Zamora took his eyes off them for the few seconds it took to work the car down toward the gully. And that is where the ordinary world ends, and the evening that would follow him for the rest of his life begins. He stopped the car and got out to go the rest of the way on foot, and that was when the roar came back. It began low and climbed, a sound with a physical weight to it, the kind you feel in the chest before you fully hear it. Under the object a flame appeared, blue at its heart, orange at its edges, and threw dust and grit off the floor of the arroyo. The thing he had taken for a wrecked car was not a car. Seen plainly now, it was smooth and rounded, egg-shaped, standing off the ground on legs of some kind, and it was beginning to lift. On its side, for a moment, he saw a marking in red. He would try to draw that symbol afterward, and people would argue about it for decades. But the symbol is worth almost nothing beside the rest of it, and we will let it go the way he saw it, once, quickly, in the noise and blown dust. The roar filled the whole of the arroyo. Zamora, who a moment before had been walking toward the thing to help, turned and went the other way. He ran, over the rise, past his own car and down, and put his face to the ground and his arms over his head, certain the shack's explosives were about to go and take the hillside with them. So, he did not watch all of it. He heard most of what came next rather than saw it, the roar holding, climbing, changing pitch. And then it stopped. And then the desert was quiet. When he raised his head, the object was up and moving, away to the southwest, low over the ground, clearing the hills without ever seeming to strain against anything until it was a point in the distance, and then it was not even that. The flame was gone, the sound with it. What was left was the plain spring evening he had driven down into, the low gold light, the greasewood, the pale ground, and an enormous quiet that gave no sign anything had happened there at all. Now there was nothing to hear but his own breath and the small ticking of his car, and a man can stand in a silence like that and begin to doubt what the noise had even been. He did not doubt it for long. He went back to his car and got on the radio and reached the dispatcher on duty that evening, a man named Nep Lopez. And here is a small human detail the whole story turns on. Zamora, reaching for a word, any word, for a thing he had no word for, told Lopez that it looked like a balloon. It was the plainest shape his mouth could find, nothing like the truth and the best he could do. Then he asked for another officer to meet him, a New Mexico State Police sergeant named Sam Chavez, someone he knew and trusted, and got out to wait. While he waited, the report already beginning its slow journey up toward an Air Force office called Project Blue Book, though he could not have known that yet. He stood at the edge of the arroyo and looked at the ground where the thing had been. The smell of burned greasewood hung in the air. The thing itself was gone, cleanly and completely, as though it had never been there. But the ground was not the same. The ground, he could already see, was going to be the whole problem. Sam Chavez came out from town within minutes, so few that when he came down the track, the brush at the bottom of the arroyo was still smoldering. He had not seen the object. Almost no one had. And this is the honest shape of the Socorro case, and it is far better to say it plainly than to slide past it. The central visual details, the craft, the two small figures, the red mark on the side, come down to us from a single witness. What the other officers found was not the object, but what it left behind. Chavez looked first at Zamora, pale and unsteady and rattled in a way his fellow officers had not seen in him before. And then he looked down. There, on the floor of the arroyo, were the marks. 4 shallow depressions, wedge-shaped, pressed into ground that was not soft, arranged roughly where the thing had stood. Between them, the greasewood was scorched and still giving off its thin smoke. The marks proved very little. They were simply too real to ignore. The depressions were fresh, and investigators found no indication that anyone had recently cut them into the hardpan. Something with real weight had rested there very recently on legs that pressed those wedges into the earth and had lifted and burned the brush beneath it as it went. A police officer had reported a thing that should not have been there, and the desert for once had kept a little of it back. Not the craft, not the figures, only a set of impressions and a scorch, the plain physical residue of an evening no one could account for. Word of a thing like that does not stay in a small town. Over the following days, more officers came, then men from farther off, Air Force investigators, an investigator from a civilian group called NICAP, eventually the scientists. And the first thing each of them did was kneel in the arroyo and look at the marks. It was the combination of the marks and the witness that kept investigators interested and kept the case from evaporating into the drawer where a police force files the stories it cannot use. Blue Book's own investigators looked into Zamora himself, the way they looked into every witness, trying to find the crack, the drinker, the joker, the man with a grudge or a taste for attention. They did not find one. What they found was an officer with a reputation for integrity and no history of chasing marvels. The file could not be closed the easy way by discrediting the man, and it could not be closed the other way either, because 2 small figures in white and a craft on legs belong in no ordinary file. Within a day or two, a scientist was on his way to Socorro to kneel in that arroyo and decide, for the United States Air Force, what had pressed the ground. The scientist's name was J. Allen Hynek, and he had made his career explaining things like this away. Hynek was an astronomer, and for years the Air Force had kept him on as its consultant. The man who took in the reports of strange lights and shapes in the sky and found, most of the time, the ordinary object underneath. A bright planet mistaken for a craft, a weather balloon, an aircraft seen at a confusing hour and angle. He arrived at cases expecting to find the seam, the place where a frightened or tired or dishonest man had stitched an ordinary evening into something impossible, and more often than not, he found it. He was not a believer, in those years, a genuine skeptic. That is precisely what makes what happened at Socorro worth sitting with. He began where he always began, with the witness. What he found in Lonnie Zamora was a plain, sober officer, honest by the account of everyone who knew him, with no appetite for the limelight. Hynek's own word for him, set down afterward, was that the man was basically sincere. He noticed, too, the thing careful investigators always trust, that Zamora, if anything, understated it. He reached over and over for the smallest, plainest words. A balloon, small adults or large children, a marking he had only half seen. A man inventing a tale reaches for more. Zamora kept reaching for less. Then Hynek went down into the arroyo and knelt in the dirt and looked at the marks. And he could not explain them. He examined the 4 wedge-shaped depressions and the burned brush between them, and took away samples of the scorched soil for the laboratory, and at the end of it, the man whose whole professional purpose was to produce the ordinary answer simply did not have one. Asked what he made of the case, Hynek did not reach for a craft from another world. That was never his way. But he would not reach for a debunking either, because the evidence in front of him would not support one. He said in as many words that he believed Lonnie Zamora had had a genuinely significant experience, that he was interested in the marks and in what the samples might show, and that, until more was known, all he could honestly offer, disappointing as he knew it would be, was that he was as puzzled as anyone. That is a small sentence, and from that particular man, it is an enormous one. The skeptic came expecting to find an ordinary explanation and knelt in the dirt and went quiet. He did not become a believer overnight, nor did he claim to know what Zamora had seen. What he had run into was the limit of the ordinary explanations available to him. He left Socorro with his soil samples and his puzzlement, and the case stayed open behind him, not because a believer insisted that it should, but because the professional doubter, standing over the marks, could not make it close. A case like Socorro does not go unexplained for want of people trying. For 60 years, investigators have come at it from every direction, and it is worth walking the road they walked, because the story of Socorro is partly the story of serious people trying to make it ordinary and not quite managing. The first place they looked was White Sands. It was the obvious place. The great government missile range lay not far off, and everyone knew that all manner of machinery was tested out there that the public never heard about, so people wondered, early and reasonably, whether Zamora had simply come upon one of those tests. An experimental craft, perhaps a lunar landing device of the kind being built in those years, set down in the empty desert on a column of flame, standing on legs. It fit much of what Zamora described. A test vehicle would roar, ride a flame, press marks into the ground, and scorch the brush, and it would want exactly that kind of unwatched country to do it in. So, investigators looked into it, checking the records they could reach and asking what had been flying that evening. And nothing surfaced that matched, no documented test at that place on that day of anything answering what Zamora had described. No lander anyone could point to had ever come with 2 small figures in white standing on the ground beside it. It explained much of the evening, but not all of it. And so, in time, attention drifted elsewhere. Years later, another possibility came forward, one closer to home and a good deal unkinder to the man. Socorro was a college town, home to what was then New Mexico Tech, a school with a long and cheerful tradition of elaborate student pranks, and the idea took hold that the whole thing had been a hoax, rigged up to fool a local cop. It did not come only from outsiders. The school's own president in later years, a respected physicist named Sterling Colgate, seemed to give it some weight. When the chemist Linus Pauling wrote to ask him about the case, Colgate replied that he had a good indication of the student who had engineered the hoax, and that the student had since left. Of the object itself, he was dismissive. A candle in a balloon, he called it. Not sophisticated. That is a real claim from a serious man in a position to know his own students. Weighed honestly, though, it is a very strange sort of hoax. It pressed 4 wedge-shaped holes into hard desert ground, roared loudly enough to send a grown officer diving for cover behind his own car, and burned the brush. And in 60 years it has never produced a name, a confession, or a single person willing to step forward and say how it was rigged, and how it fooled Sam Chavez and J. Allen Hynek and everyone else who knelt in that arroyo. A candle in a balloon does none of those things. So the road runs on, and it keeps arriving at the same place. Careful and unsentimental people have taken this case up and turned it over. The Air Force, a professional skeptic, a physicist who suspected his own students, and every time a piece of it is left over in the hand. The piece in the middle. The marks in the dirt and the 2 figures in white that no undocumented lander and no candle in a balloon has ever quite reached. For everyone else, Socorro became something to argue about. For Lonnie Zamora, it stayed one evening he could not finish. He had not wanted any of it. He had gone down into that arroyo to help a stranger he believed might be hurt, and come back up with a thing he could neither explain nor escape. The publicity found him, the way it finds the reluctant more cruelly than the willing, and so did the teasing, the long, grinding, small-town business of being the officer who saw the flying saucer. He did not grow the story to meet the attention, nor take it back to be rid of it. In the end, he said something very plain about the whole business, that with all the kidding he had taken, it was hardly worth his while to have said anything at all, and that even so, he meant to stick to his word. He had seen it. That was the entire claim, start to finish, and he was not going to pretend otherwise to make his own life easier. In time, the arroyo itself softened back into the country around it. For a while, there was talk of preserving the spot, walkways and benches, so people could stand where the thing had stood, and some of it was built a little apart from the real location. Even that carries a strange footnote. The improvements were set some distance from the true spot, partly because of a rumor around town that the original ground was contaminated, left dangerous by whatever had rested on it. Whether there was anything to it hardly matters. It is the kind of unease that grows up around a place like this, a patch of desert people would rather admire from a few steps back. But the marks did not last. The wind came, as it always comes, and the rare hard rain, and the hard ground that had held 4 wedge-shaped depressions and a scorch of burned brush gave them up a little at a time until there was nothing there to see at all, only greasewood and pale ground, and the long gold light coming in low across it in the late afternoon. The desert kept no answers. It only held, and then slowly surrendered a few impressions in the dirt. That is the shape of it, if an open story has a shape. No craft explained, no hoax proven, no verdict of any kind. Only a steady man who lost an evening to something he could not name, a scientist who came to explain it and couldn't, and a stretch of desert that held the marks a little while and then let them go. Zamora went on being a policeman, and then he stopped and lived out his life in the same town beneath the same sky. He carried the 24th of April the whole way and told it when he told it plainly and never made it larger than it was. He died an old man in Socorro and never got the evening back. Go back at the very last to the roar, the sound that started all of it, that sent an ordinary man down a gravel track to see who needed help. What is strange about Socorro is not the craft or the two figures or the red mark no one can read. It is that a plain man went toward a plain sound, found something with no place in the record, and then heard the sound climb and stop and leave him in a silence that never quite gave the evening back. So, let the quiet be the last of it. Tomorrow, the desert south of Socorro will lie exactly as it always has, low and open and still, the light coming in gold across the greasewood in the late afternoon. Somewhere down in an arroyo, the ground has long since closed over whatever rested there on a spring evening a lifetime ago, and the practical man who had heard a roar and gone down to help carried the roar and the silence that came after quietly to the end of his days. Tonight we stay up late with Captain Lawrence Coyne, whose routine flight home became one of the best documented military UFO encounters in American history. When 4 Army airmen reported a near collision with an unidentified object over Mansfield, Ohio, and a helicopter that climbed nearly 2,000 feet without anyone touching the controls. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. On the evening of October 18, 1973, 4 crewmen of a United States Army Reserve Medical Evacuation Unit were in Columbus, Ohio, for their annual flight physicals. They spent the evening being weighed and measured and pronounced fit. Every man aboard certified that night in writing as sound of body and mind. They left the medical facility around 10 o'clock, drove back to the airport, filed a flight plan and warmed up their aircraft, a Belle Iroquois, the workhorse everyone called the Huey, flying under the call sign Army 15444. Home was Cleveland Hopkins, up to the northeast. An hour of flying, a little more. They lifted off from Port Columbus at about 10:30. The night was on their side, clear, cool, a little over 40 degrees, the stars out, the wind light, visibility 15 miles or better. First Lieutenant Arrigo Jezzi took the controls for the trip home, and the helicopter settled onto its course at 2,500 feet and 90 knots. Below them, the farm country of central Ohio rolled past. Dark fields, the occasional yard light, small towns strung along the highways, most of them already turned in for the night. 4 healthy men, a familiar machine, a route they had flown before. The town of Mansfield lay ahead on the track, a little more than halfway home. On the night of October 18, 1973, near Mansfield, Ohio, the 4-man crew of Army Helicopter 15444, Captain Lawrence Coyne, First Lieutenant Arrigo Jezzi, Sergeant John Healy, and Specialist Robert Janasek, reported that a red light converged on their aircraft at 2,500 feet, that their radios went silent, that an unidentified gray object passed close overhead and lit the cockpit green, and that the helicopter climbed roughly 1,800 feet with the controls set for descent. All 4 signed the Army's report. Their separate accounts, retold and re-examined over many years, never came apart. It helps to know who was in those seats, because what the Army got that night was very nearly a panel of professional witnesses assembled by accident. Captain Lawrence Coyne, 36, in the front right seat, was the unit's commander, 19 years in the Army Reserve, rated in airplanes, helicopters, and seaplanes, and in civilian life, a one-time plainclothes officer with the Cleveland Police. Sergeant John Healy, 35, the flight medic behind him, was a detective in the intelligence unit of that police department, a man whose working life consisted of deciding which stories held up. Specialist Robert Janasek, 23, the crew chief in the other rear seat, serviced computers for IBM and had crewed helicopters on active duty in Vietnam. He knew the sound and shape of aircraft at night the way a farmer knows weather. Jesse, at the controls, was a chemical engineer, the newest man aboard. Skeptics would spend years probing this crew for the usual soft spots and find remarkably little to work with. Somewhere past the halfway point, around 11 o'clock, Healy noticed a single red light off to the west on his side of the aircraft. It was doing nothing worth reporting. Aircraft carry red lights, and the sky over Ohio has never lacked for aircraft. He watched it a moment and let it go and did not mention it to anyone. A few minutes later, Janasek picked up a red light of his own on the opposite side, low on the eastern horizon. This one held steady. It seemed to pace the helicopter, keeping station off their right side, neither gaining nor falling behind. He watched it for perhaps a minute, turning over the ordinary possibilities: a radio tower beacon, a light aircraft running along the same airway. Then he keyed the intercom and told the captain. Coyne's reply was the reply of a man 20 minutes from home. "Keep an eye on it," he said. Janasek kept an eye on it. About 30 seconds later, he spoke again, and this time his voice had changed. The light was no longer pacing them. It had turned, and it was coming at them. Coyne took the controls from Jesse. He looked out the right window and saw the red light closing fast at their own altitude on what pilots call a collision course, which is a term of art that means exactly what it sounds like. His first thought was entirely reasonable: a military jet. Mansfield Airport lay only a few miles off, and the Ohio Air National Guard flew F-100 fighters out of it. A fighter moving that quickly would explain the speed. He reached for the radio to warn it off. Mansfield Tower answered his first call, an acknowledgement his call sign read back, and then the radio went quiet. Coyne tried again. Nothing. He switched from UHF to VHF and tried both frequencies. The equipment showed every sign of working. The channels simply carried no voices. 4 men in an aluminum machine over dark farmland with a light rushing at them and nobody on the line. Coyne did what the emergency procedures said to do about converging traffic. He pushed the collective down and put the helicopter into a descent, 500 feet a minute at first, then steeper, until the vertical speed indicator showed 2,000 feet a minute, which in a Huey at night is not a maneuver. It is an escape. The altimeter unwound past 2,000 feet, toward 1,700, with the dark hills of Richland County somewhere below them at 1,100. And still the light came on. Janasek called it out as it grew. Coyne looked up from the instruments and made the calculation every pilot dreads, the one where the closing speed erases every option, and said out loud the sentence that ends the ordinary part of this story. "That's no F-100. The crew braced for the collision. The object did not hit them. By every account given afterward, it did something harder to file. It stopped. Whatever had crossed several miles of sky in a handful of seconds decelerated smoothly in almost no distance at all and hung above and ahead of the helicopter, filling the top of the windshield. Coyne, Healy, and Yana Sek all described the shape the light belonged to, and their descriptions agreed in the ways that matter. An elongated metallic body, gray, without wings, without rotors, 60 feet or so of it. A red light at the nose, a white light at the tail. And underneath, toward the rear, something like a lamp housing, from which a beam of green light swung slowly around and back and down, through the top of the windshield, through the tinted upper panels, and into the cockpit. For a moment, everything turned green. The instrument faces, the men's hands, the whole interior of the aircraft, nose to tail, lit the color of the deep end of a pool. Jesse, in the left seat with his view partly blocked by the cabin roof, saw less than the others, a bright white light above them, nothing more that he would swear to. It would have been tidier for everyone if all four men had told one story in one voice. They never did, and Jesse never adjusted his account to match his crewmates, and investigators came to regard that stubborn mismatch as one of the more convincing details in the file. 4 identical stories sound rehearsed. 3 men describing a craft and a 4th describing only a light sounds like 4 seats with 4 views. There was no heat from the beam, no sound from the object, no wake, no wash of air against the rotor, none of the physical company a machine that size keeps. It held there over them, the cockpit washed in that color, for a time none of them could later fix precisely. 10 seconds, perhaps. It was not the kind of interval anyone was timing. Then it moved off to the west, unhurried, and the crew began to breathe again, and Coyne glanced down at his instruments to recover the aircraft from its dive. The dive was gone. The altimeter read 3,500 feet, and it was climbing. Hold the arithmetic of that in mind for a moment. Coyne had last seen his altimeter at 1,700 feet, going down at 2,000 feet a minute, with the collective, the lever in a helicopter that commands lift, pushed full down against its stop. It was still full down. And the aircraft was at 3,500 feet, rising at 1,000 feet a minute. A helicopter with its collective bottomed does not climb. That is not a matter of opinion or of skill. It is what the control is. The lever was down, the machine was going up, and neither Coyne nor Jesse, both watching the instruments now, could make those two facts live together. Coyne looked again. The lever had not moved. He knew where his hand had left it, full down against the stop, where a pilot puts it when he wants the ground. 19 years of flying said the aircraft should be dropping out of the sky. The altimeter kept winding up. Coyne raised the collective, the input that should have made the climb worse, and the helicopter kept rising on its own terms through 3,600, 3,700, toward 3,800 feet. Then the crew felt a slight bump like a car crossing a seam in the pavement, and the aircraft was theirs again. The controls answered. The climb stopped. Coyne descended to 2,500 feet, pointed the nose at Cleveland, and flew. Off to the west, the object showed its white tail light for a while, then made a sharp turn toward the northwest, a turn the crew judged far too tight for anything with wings, and dropped below the horizon near Lake Erie and was gone. Below them, Ohio had noticed nothing. Porch lights burned in the farmyards, trucks moved along Route 30, the little town slept on. Whatever had just happened above Mansfield belonged for now to 4 men in a helicopter. The radios came back the way they had gone, without ceremony. Near Ashland, Coyne raised Akron approach control on the first try, got a position fix, and completed the flight. From first light on the horizon to an empty sky had been, by the best later reconstruction, about 5 minutes. The tightest part of it, the convergence, the beam, the climb, had taken less than 1. They landed at Cleveland Hopkins, shut the aircraft down, and did the thing that separates this case from 1,000 campfire stories. They reported it. That night, to the FAA station at the field, in writing to the Army on the standard form for a near mid-air collision, a form that had never been designed for the box Coyne now had to check, so the report went in under a heading improvised for the occasion: near mid-air collision with UFO. The morning after is where most stories like this one dissolve. This one instead turned into documents. Coyne and Janasek, before comparing notes, each sketched what they had seen. Jesse remembered the drawings coming out alike. The Army's operational hazard report went up the chain with all 4 names on it, locating the aircraft south-southeast of Mansfield at 2,500 feet and describing an object converging at better than 600 knots. And Coyne went to see the head of FAA operations in Cleveland to ask the perfectly practical question of a pilot who has just been moved 1,800 feet against his will. Who investigates this? Vollmer's answer in substance was, nobody. There was no office for it. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's long clearinghouse for such reports, had been closed for 4 years. He did not doubt the crew. Asked about Coyne, he said he trusted his judgment without a question of a doubt. But there was simply no desk in the federal government where a report like this one was supposed to land. The most credentialed cockpit full of witnesses the field had seen in years, 4 signatures on official paper, and no one whose job it was to read it. What checking did get done mostly came back empty in both directions at once. When the FAA's tape from Mansfield was pulled, it was blank. Not even Coyne's first call, the one he heard acknowledged, was on it. Radar coverage in that corner of Ohio reached down only to about 3,500 feet, so the encounter had happened underneath the picture. No target was recorded of the object or of the descending helicopter. An FAA inspector examined the aircraft and found it undamaged and functioning normally. The one physical oddity anyone pointed to was the magnetic compass, which by crew accounts was never right afterward and was eventually replaced, though the maintenance records that would nail that down were never located. Nothing in that list proves the crew's account. Nothing in it touches the account either. The evening passed below the radar, off the tape, and outside every jurisdiction, and left behind exactly one durable trace, the report itself. The press found the story within days. The first article was written as it happened by a plain dealer reporter who shared the captain's surname and family, and the case began its long second life in newsprint. Coyne kept telling it the way he had told it the first night, without embroidery. For 3 years, the crew's account stood alone. Then, after a public appeal for witnesses in 1976, an investigator named Jenny Zeidman found the family on Route 430. On the night of the encounter, a mother had been driving 4 children home along that road, which runs east out of Mansfield past Charles Mill Reservoir, dark water, dark woods, the kind of stretch where headlights are the only lights. 2 of the children, Charles and Karen, gave the fullest account. They had noticed a bright light in the sky, red and green, coming down fast. Then a second set of lights flashing, lower, and with it a sound they knew from television and the highway, the flat chop of a helicopter. The car stopped. The children got out. What they described next, they described without knowing what 4 men in that helicopter had reported 3 years earlier. The larger object came over the smaller one and held there, just ahead of it and above it. A green light came on. And then came the phrase the children kept returning to, the one Zeidman wrote down more than once. Everything turned green. The road, the trees, the car, the helicopter beneath the object, all of it briefly the wrong color. Then the light was gone, and the bigger shape moved off, and the family drove home, and mostly did not talk about it. Testimony recovered 3 years late is worth less than testimony taken the same night. Zeidman said so herself, and it is only honest to say it here. Memories drift, and by 1976 the case had been in the papers. But the family's position on that road, at that hour, matched the helicopter's reconstructed track, and so did the pairing of lights and the rotor noise. And the detail a coached witness would be least likely to supply, not a beam, not a spotlight, but the whole countryside changing color at once, matched the cockpit accounts almost word for word from half a mile below. The crew had described 5 minutes from the inside. Here, at last, was the outside of the 5 minutes, a wide shot of the small helicopter on its way home, and the long, dark shape standing over it above the reservoir, and the green light joining them together. A case this clean attracts serious critics, and the Coyne encounter drew the most dogged of them all. Philip Klass, the aviation journalist who made a career of taking UFO reports apart, proposed that the crew had seen a meteor, one of the bright fireballs that cross October skies, low and fast and gone. It was never a foolish idea, and fireballs have fooled pilots before. But a fireball is a matter of seconds, a streak, a flare, a fading trail. The object over Mansfield, by the reconstruction built from the crew's separate accounts, was in view for about 5 minutes, and in the closest part of those minutes it slowed down, stopped, and stood still in the air. Meteors do many things. Hovering is not one of them. Even Klass allowed that if the object stayed in view anywhere near that long, his explanation failed. Conventional aircraft have been suggested as well. None fit much better. No airplane carries that steady red, white, and green arrangement of lights. No airplane crosses miles of sky in seconds and then hangs quietly over a helicopter, and when the traffic that night was checked, there was nothing to find. The last fighter into Mansfield had landed a quarter hour before the encounter. Decades on in debates, the researcher Kevin Randall would map out. A subtler version was weighed, a large aircraft passing close overhead, stirring the air enough to lift the helicopter and fool its instruments. That one, at least, takes the climb seriously. It just requires an enormous airplane over Mansfield that nobody heard, nobody tracked, and nobody ever traced, mistaken at close range for a silent hovering shape by a crew chief who had spent a war around aircraft, while a family below watched the countryside turn green. Each explanation held up to the full account solves one piece by breaking 2 others. And this case had careful people on it for years. Zeidman, who had worked for Project Blue Book before any of this, gave the better part of a decade to the case, interviewing the crew separately and together, walking the timeline second by second, driving Route 430. Working alongside her was J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had been the Air Force's own house skeptic for 2 decades before the unexplained residue of his files wore his certainty away. The man who would spend the last years of his life, a decade after Mansfield, chasing a silent boomerang up and down the Hudson Valley. Hynek had personally explained away hundreds of red lights in the night sky. This one he kept. Zeidman's own conclusion, after all those years, ran to a single, unglamorous sentence. The object was real, and it was not any aircraft, meteor, or phenomenon she could identify. Not a spacecraft. She never said that. Just a thing that was there and that no paperwork could make into anything ordinary. The 4 men went back to their lives. Nobody sold a book. Nobody went on the lecture circuit. Healy went back to detective work, Janasek to his computers, Jesse to engineering. Coyne stayed in the Army Reserve and kept flying. In November of 1978, Lawrence Coyne put on his uniform and told the story one last time for the record at the United Nations before a committee weighing whether the world's governments should study such reports at all. He read it plainly, the way he had reported it the first night. The departure at 10:30, the clear sky, the red light, the lost radios, the green beam, the climb he did not command. He offered no theory of what the object was. He asked only that incidents like his be investigated, and he closed with the sentence he had earned over 5 years of telling. I am convinced this object was real. Real is a modest word, and it may be the exactly right one. Somewhere over the dark farms east of Mansfield on an October night, something occupied 5 minutes of 4 careful men's lives and 1,800 feet of their altitude, and then gave them back. The evening left almost nothing behind: a blank tape, an empty radar picture, a compass that wandered, a form with an improvised title. The sky it happened in looks tonight the way it looked then: quiet, black, crossed now and again by the small moving lights of ordinary aircraft, each one exactly what it appears to be. Nearly every one of them always is. Coyne flew that route again many times in the years after. The country below stayed dark and kept its counsel: the reservoir, the woods, the road where a family once stood beside their car looking up. And if you were ever driving that road late past Charles Mill in the small hours, you might find yourself doing what the children did without deciding to, glancing up just once at the empty air above the water, half remembering a night when everything for a few seconds turned green. Tonight we stay up late with Kenneth Arnold, remembered as the man who gave the world the phrase flying saucer, though he spent his life insisting it was never quite what he meant. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. On the 24th of June, 1947, a pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying a small aircraft across the Cascade Range in Washington state. He was a businessman by trade out of Boise, Idaho, and he sold fire suppression equipment. He flew the mountains the way other men drove the highways, for work on his own schedule in his own plane. Flying that country was nothing unusual for him. It was another workday. He knew the Cascades from the air, the long green folds of them and the white peaks standing up out of them, and he was not a man given to seeing things that were not there. On this particular afternoon, he had a reason to slow down and look. A marine transport plane had gone down somewhere near Mount Rainier, and there was a reward posted, a fair sum, for whoever found the wreck. So Arnold, with time and daylight in hand, turned off his route and went looking for it. That is the first thing to hold on to about this whole affair, and it is easy to lose under everything that came after. He was not hunting for the strange. He was hunting for one lost airplane in the hope of the reward, and he never found it. What he found instead was a flash of light. It came a little before 3 in the afternoon, off to his left, near the great white shoulder of Mount Rainier. A flash so brief he almost dismissed it, like sun catching a mirror. His first thought was another aircraft, dangerously close, and he looked hard around his own plane for it. There was nothing near him. And then the flashing came again, and this time it resolved into a shape, or rather into 9 of them, a long chain of bright objects strung out across the sky ahead, moving toward the peak. He did the ordinary things a careful pilot does. He rocked his own aircraft to see if the light was a reflection off his glass. Off came his glasses, and he looked again. Later, he rolled his side window down and looked with nothing between his eyes and the air. The objects were still there. They were flying in a long, stepped line, weaving between the smaller peaks, catching the sun and throwing it back in flashes as they banked. He looked for wings and for tails, the way you would on any aircraft, and he could not find them. There was a clock set into his instrument panel, an ordinary aircraft clock, and Arnold, being the sort of man he was, decided to time the thing rather than simply marvel at it. He picked a landmark the objects were passing, and he waited for them to reach the next one, and he watched the second hand go around. It is a small, practical act, and the rest of his life quietly turned on it. Arnold wanted something he could measure. Measurements could be checked, impressions could not. A number was something he could hold. He got it. Let the plane hang there a moment in the clear June air and take the sighting slowly, because it was over quickly, and quickness is the enemy of a story told at this hour. The objects crossed in front of Mount Rainier, dark now in profile against the snow, and Arnold watched them go. They were thin, he would say, and flat. He kept reaching for kitchen shapes to describe them, a pie pan, a disc, something rounded in front and cut off behind. 8 of them held that shape. One did not. One was more like a crescent and rode a little apart from the others. They flew, he said, not in the steady way of aircraft, but with a weaving, dipping motion, like the tail of a kite in a high wind, tilting and flashing as they turned. He was not frightened exactly. He was a working pilot watching something fly in a way he had never seen anything fly, and the working pilot in him was busy, measuring, timing, comparing them against the far white peaks. What he kept coming back to afterward was what he could not see. There were no wings. There were no tails, no fuselage, none of the parts a pilot's eye goes hunting for to make sense of a thing in the air. Something that size moving like that should have carried all of it, and it carried none. It should have come with a wall of engine noise, too, a formation crossing in front of him that close, and there was nothing he could hear over his own motor. A lifetime in the sky had taught him what airplanes were, and this was most of what stayed with him. Not a strange shape, but the familiar shapes that were missing. They went from Mount Rainier toward Mount Adams, the next great peak to the south, and Arnold watched the clock. A little over a minute and a half, That was the span from the one mountain to the other by the second hand in front of him. He knew that stretch of country. He knew, roughly, how far it was between those peaks. And when he worked it out afterward, on the ground, with a pencil, the number he got was one he did not quite believe himself. So he made it smaller. The speed he had worked out was far past anything that flew in those years, a year still before the sound barrier had even been broken. Arnold did not round it up to impress anyone. He rounded it down. He shaved it to a figure he could defend, and even that was well beyond any machine then known. A man exaggerating for attention does not trim his own best number. Arnold trimmed his. The smaller figure was the one he could stand behind, and standing behind things was his whole character. Then it was over. The objects reached Mount Adams and thinned and were gone into the distance the way a flight of birds is suddenly gone, there, and then a strain of the eye, and then nothing. The sky over the Cascades was empty and blue and entirely ordinary. Under 3 minutes had passed, start to finish. Then the ordinary came back all at once. The mountains went back to being mountains. The engine, which he had stopped hearing, was loud in his ears again. Nothing else crossed the sky. There was the airplane, and the afternoon, and a man alone in a cockpit with something he had nowhere to put. He had the better part of an hour of ordinary flying left, and he flew it with that. The country went by underneath exactly as it had before. The wheat fields, the roads, the small towns, none of it aware that anything had happened. He did not yet know whether he would tell a soul. The fields slid past, and the thing turned over in his mind, unshared and unexplained until the wheels came down. He flew on to Yakima and then to Pendleton, Oregon, and along the way, he told a few other pilots what he had seen. They did what pilots do. They offered ordinary answers. Guided missiles, some new machine the Army was flying and not talking about. Arnold half wanted one of those answers to be true. But he had the clock's number in his pocket, and the shape of the thing in his eye, and no wings anywhere in the memory. He landed at Pendleton with a story he did not know what to do with, and no idea at all that by naming it out loud to a reporter, he was about to lose control of it forever. Before we go on, it is worth setting down the bare record once, plainly, the way a clerk would file it. On the 24th of June, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over the Cascade Range in Washington State, searching for a downed military transport. A little before 3 in the afternoon, near Mount Rainier, he saw 9 bright objects flying in a long chain, weaving between the peaks at a speed he could not account for. He timed their passage from Mount Rainier to Mount Adams on the clock in his instrument panel. He landed, told the story to reporters in Pendleton, Oregon, and within days it had reached front pages across the country. Describing how the objects moved, Arnold reached for a comparison. A saucer skipped across water, and from that comparison the newspapers settled on a phrase, flying saucer. The objects were never explained. The phrase never went away. That is the record. Now, the word. When Arnold landed at Pendleton, he went the next day to the East Oregonian, the local daily in a wheat and cattle town, and told what he had seen to 2 reporters there, a man named Bill Beckett among them. They took him for what he was, sober, specific, selling nothing. Beckett wrote it up plainly, and this is the part that matters. He handed it to the Associated Press wire, the shared pipe that carried a local story out to every paper in the country. A pilot's odd afternoon over the Cascades left Pendleton that day as a few paragraphs of wire copy. By the next morning, it had come down in newsrooms from coast to coast, and in each of them a different editor, working fast against a deadline, had to find a few words to set over it. That is where the phrase was born, not in Arnold's mouth and not in any one of those rooms, but in most of them at once, all reaching for the same easy image. Here is the thing almost everyone gets slightly wrong, and it is the whole of the story, so it is worth getting right. Arnold did not say the objects were shaped like saucers. What he said, reaching the way any of us reaches when we are trying to describe a motion we have no name for, was that they moved a certain way. They flew, he said, the way a saucer would if you skipped it across water, that low, skimming, dipping flight. He was describing the motion. He was, if anything, careful about the shapes themselves, which he compared to pie pans and crescents and discs. But motion is hard to print, and a shape is easy, and somewhere between Arnold's mouth in Pendleton and the front pages of the next morning, the comparison came loose from the thing it described. It is not even clear that any one person did it or meant to. The historians who have gone back through the newspapers of those few days cannot point to a single reporter and say, "There, that one, that is who coined it." It seems to have formed in the space between the telephone and the headline, the wire services, the copy desks, the editors reaching for 3 quick words to sit over a strange story. The phrase that came out was flying saucer. And it was perfect, and it was wrong, and it was everywhere by the end of the week. The clock had measured seconds. The headlines did not measure anything at all. Arnold watched it happen and could not stop it. He gave more interviews, and in every one of them he tried to set the record straight. It was the motion, he kept saying, not the shape. And every correction sank without a trace beneath the phrase itself, which was already off and running, already being printed over sightings in other states, other countries, by people who had never heard his name and never would. The word had left him. It belonged to the newspapers now, and to everyone who read them, and it was busy becoming the name of a whole era of the strange, an era Kenneth Arnold had started by accident and would spend the rest of his life standing slightly outside of, correcting a sentence no one wanted corrected. What happens to an ordinary man when the whole country decides it knows what he said? For a while it came as a flood, and it came to his door. Arnold ran his business out of Boise, and the mail that had once been orders and invoices now arrived by the sack. He would sit with it, letter after letter, at the desk of a man who sold fire extinguishers for a living, people who had seen their own lights in their own skies, people with theories, people who wanted him to know the objects were angels or Russians or visitors from another world, and a good number who simply wanted to tell him he was a fool. He said to one reporter that half the people looked at him as some combination of Einstein, Flash Gordon, and a screwball, and that he wondered what his wife back in Idaho was making of it all. It is a funny line, and it is not really a funny line. It is a practical man discovering that his own name has stopped being his, the way his own words already had. The teasing found him the way it finds the reluctant, more than it ever finds the willing. He had not gone looking for any of this. He had gone looking for a downed plane, and now he was the flying saucer man, in the diners and at the airfields, for the rest of his life. The official world was no kinder, in its own flat way. The Army looked into the sightings and interviewed him, and the men who sat with him came away plainly convinced he was telling the truth as he knew it. One of them wrote that it was hard to believe a man of his character would make such a report if he had not seen something. And the explanation the Army eventually offered in public came down to a single word: mirage. He had seen, they said, a trick of the light off the mountains. He could not let it lie, and trying not to let it lie pulled him somewhere he did not belong. A magazine editor drew him into looking at another case down on Maury Island in Puget Sound, a murky, tangled business that turned out to be mostly hoax. 2 military officers who had gathered material from that investigation died when their plane went down on the flight home, and a whisper went around that the plane had been brought down on purpose. The whisper was never anything more than a whisper, but Arnold was near enough to feel the cold of it. He had wanted, in the beginning, only to be believed. Instead, he found himself wandering the edges of a world of hoaxes and rumors and men who died in crashes, a world with his accidental phrase written all over it and no clean way back out. And somewhere in all of that is the moment the whole episode turns on. It is not the sighting. The sighting was 3 clear minutes he was always sure of. It is quieter than that, and worse, the moment Arnold understood that the correcting would never work, that he could say it was the motion, not the shape 1,000 times, in 1,000 rooms, and the phrase would go on exactly as it was, because it had stopped being about him at all. He had described something carefully once, and the world had taken the description and remade it, and handed him back a name he never chose, and there was nothing, not one thing, he could do about it. The careful man had become the saucer man. He would go on defending a record no one would let him fix. Pull the camera back for a moment before it settles on him again, because the accident he set off did not stay small. His sighting, and the wave of others that followed it that summer, landed on desks in Washington, and the men at those desks could not agree on what to do with them, and the disagreement itself became a kind of machine. Arnold's case was one of the ones they could not comfortably file away. It became one of the pushes, not the only one, but a real one, that moved the Army toward a formal study of these things, the study that would be called Project Sign, and then Project Grudge, and at last the long-running one most people have heard of, Project Blue Book. None of that happened because Kenneth Arnold proved anything. It happened because he made the institutions respond. A man looking for a lost airplane had, by accident, obliged his government to open a filing cabinet it would keep open for the better part of 30 years. Now let the camera come back to him, because that is where this belongs. Arnold himself got no reward from any of it. He wrote a book once, trying to set his own record down in his own words. He ran for office in Idaho and lost. And as the years went on, he grew tired and then bitter about the one thing that had never stopped stinging. That people kept questioning his honesty, his character, the plain report of a plain man. In his later years, he mostly stopped talking about it. He turned down the interviews and let the flying saucer world go on without him. He had said what he saw. The saying had cost him more than it was ever worth, and he was done spending himself on it. But hold the other half of it, the half that is easy to let slip. History remembers the phrase. The phrase became famous, more famous than the man, more famous than the mountains. But the phrase was never the thing Arnold was trying to describe, and underneath it the whole time the plainer mystery has gone on, sitting there, unbothered and unanswered. 9 bright objects crossed in front of Mount Rainier that afternoon, weaving between the peaks, and thinned into the distance past Mount Adams, and were never explained by anyone. Not by the Army, not by the mirage, not by the years. The word is not the answer to that mystery. The word is only part of it. Go back at the very last to the clock, to the small, practical act of a man in a cockpit waiting for a second hand to come around, wanting a number he could stand behind. He measured the minutes correctly. He described the movement correctly. The only thing he could not control was what the world decided to call it, and the world decided quickly and never changed its mind. Everything came after that afternoon. Thousands of people in the years since have reported strange things in the sky. Some of those stories faded and were forgotten. Some grew in the telling. A few hardened into legends that will outlast everyone who ever argued about them. And nearly all of them trace back, if the line is followed far enough, to one working pilot, one ordinary afternoon over these mountains, and one sentence that history quietly changed on its way to the front page. So let that be the last of it. Nearly everyone alive knows the phrase flying saucer. It is in every language now, over every strange light in every sky. Almost no one knows the name of the man who spent his life insisting he had never quite meant it that way. Somewhere over the Cascades tonight, the peaks are standing where they always stood, dark against the last of the light, and the air between them is empty and blue and ordinary. And a careful pilot who once looked for one lost airplane and found 9 of something else and reached for his clock instead of a word, carried that afternoon and everything the world made of it quietly to the end of his days. Tonight, we drive north of the city into a valley where, for 4 winters running, thousands of people looked up from the same few roads and saw the same enormous shape pass over, slow and lit, and making no sound at all. This is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. The wave is usually said to begin on the last night of 1981 in the town of Kent, New York, a little before midnight. A retired police officer was outside his house in the cold when something to the south caught his attention. A line of lights was moving toward him above the tree line. Red and green and white. He had spent a career watching the roads and the sky over them, and he knew what aircraft looked like at night, and this was not that. It was too low and far too slow. And as it came on over the houses, it made no sound at all. The lights were not separate. They were carried on something, a dark mass behind them, wide and angled, blotting out the stars it passed in front of. The shape of a boomerang, people would say later, or the shape of a V. It crossed above him without hurry and went off to the north, and the night was quiet again. A few miles away near the interstate, a man named Ed Hansen was driving when the same lights, or lights very like them, came into his windshield. He slowed. So did the cars around him. Strangers pulled onto the shoulder of the highway together and stood by their open doors, watching a thing none of them could name drift over the valley in silence. Not one witness alone on an empty road, but a handful of them, turning to one another to confirm that they were all seeing it. By itself, one night of strange lights is nothing remarkable. Every county in America has a story like it, told once at a gas station and let go. What happened in the Hudson Valley is that it did not stay one night. The lights came back. By day, the valley fed the city. Its great reservoirs, held behind dams in the hills of Putnam and Westchester, sent their water south through buried aqueducts to the taps of New York 60 miles down the river. Engineers left the IBM campuses at dusk, the long, low buildings still lit behind them, blue-white in the early dark. Trains carried commuters home from Manhattan along the eastern bank, and the parkways carried the rest, north into the hills, headlights threading the same valleys after every working day. It was a place balanced between two worlds, close enough to the largest city in the country to commute to it, and rural enough, a few miles off the parkway, to go fully dark at night. And it went very dark. Past the last shopping plaza, the towns thinned into woods and reservoirs and old stone walls, and the sky came down close over the ridges. In winter, especially, with the trees bare and the ground hard and the early night arriving by 5 o'clock, the valley emptied out into something quiet and old. The water lay black behind the dams, the commuters were home behind their doors, and the cold settled over the hills. These were not credulous people on the whole. The towns of the lower valley were full of the technical middle class, engineers, programmers, nurses, school teachers, police officers, the sort who worked for the big companies along the river and prided themselves on a sober eye. If you wanted to invent a place where a strange thing in the sky would be doubted hardest and examined most carefully, you could hardly do better than a county full of IBM engineers driving home, tired on a winter night. This is also the kind of place the older investigators had learned to watch. A patch of ground that fills a filing cabinet with sightings while the next county over stays quiet for a generation. Water and high ground and a dense, wakeful population to do the seeing. The valley had all three. It was, in the language of the field, a window. We will come back to that word, because by the end it may matter more than the shape itself. That, then, is the place. The black reservoirs, the emptied parkways, the lit windows of the engineers, a valley between the country and the city, going dark under the winter sky, with no idea yet that it had been chosen. Most of the wave came in ones and twos. A family, a car full of teenagers, a man walking his dog. One night was different. On the night of the 24th of March, 1983, the calls began a little after 8 o'clock. Drivers on the Taconic State Parkway in Westchester and Putnam counties pulled onto the shoulder to watch an enormous formation of colored lights move slowly south. Police switchboards in Yorktown and the towns around it took report after report through the evening, hundreds of them from separate callers who had never spoken to one another. The witnesses described the same thing, a single object as wide as a football field, or larger, carrying red and green and white lights, drifting no faster than traffic in town and making no sound. Some said it stopped and hung over the parkway a while before moving on. The investigators who later gathered the accounts estimated that several thousand people saw it that one night. Inside the police stations, the night had its own texture. A dispatcher takes one call about lights in the sky and writes it off without much thought. But the lines kept lighting up, one board, then the next town's board, the same description coming in from roads miles apart, from callers who could not possibly have arranged it. Dispatchers began reading the reports to one another over the radio, comparing them and finding that they matched. That is the moment a routine shift turns into something a station house remembers for years. They sent officers out the way they had to. A woman called to say the thing was directly over her house and she was frightened. A patrolman was sent to calm her down, and the patrolman got out of his car, looked up, and saw it too. This happened more than once that spring. The officer dispatched to explain the lights away, who instead became another witness to them, standing in a backyard with his report half-written, watching the same shape his callers had described. It is one matter to doubt a frightened stranger. It is harder to doubt the man you sent to check on her. For one evening, the valley's private, scattered strangeness became a public event. And then, near midnight, the lights moved off over the hills, and the phones went quiet, and the thing the whole county had just watched together left nothing behind for any of them to hold. The strangest part of a night like that is the morning that follows it. The Hudson Valley woke up to itself. Local papers carried the lights on the front page, careful, hedged reporting, full of the word reportedly, but on the front page all the same. Radio shows that took calls found their lines jammed by people who had seen it, and people who wanted to argue that the first people were mistaken, and a few who only wanted to say, quietly on the air, that they had seen it too and had not told anyone. The morning shows filled with it. The valley spent the day talking to itself about the night before. And in the talking, the thing changed shape again, not in the sky now, but in the mind of the county. A man who had pulled onto the Taconic alone, certain he had seen something no one would believe, came into work to find 3 other people on his floor, had seen it from 3 other roads. A woman who had decided to say nothing heard her own experience described, almost word for word, by a stranger calling a radio station. All across the valley, people who had each carried a small private impossibility discovered over coffee and across desks that they were not carrying it alone. The police felt it from the other side. Departments compared notes between towns and found the reports lined up across jurisdictions. Officers who had laughed at the first calls had stopped laughing. None of them had an explanation that is worth being plain about. What they had was a great many reports they could not dismiss and could not account for, and the particular discomfort of professional skeptics who had looked and found nothing to arrest, nothing to ticket, nothing to file under any heading they knew. By now, the silence bothered people more than the lights. A strange light in the sky is almost ordinary. The country is full of them. But a shape that size passing low over a parkway should have come with a wall of engine noise, and it had come with nothing, and that absence was the detail people kept circling back to in the diner booths and the call-in shows. The lights they could have argued about. The silence sat wrong in a way that argument could not reach. By evening, the valley was watching the sky on purpose, and the sky for a while kept giving it reasons too. Gather enough of the accounts and the same handful of details rise to the top, worn smooth by repetition. The size first. People reached for the largest things they knew to measure it against. A football field, a city block, an aircraft carrier turned on its side in the air. Whatever it was big enough to fill the gap between 2 ridgelines, big enough that a person standing under it lost the edges of it in the dark. More than one witness reached for the same uneasy comparison. Not a craft in the sky so much as a piece of the sky gone solid and begun to move. Then the lights and the way they behaved. They ran along the leading edge in a shallow V, and they changed. Red sliding to green, green to white, sometimes the whole array pulsing together in a slow rhythm. Now and then every light would go dark at once, and for a moment there would be nothing overhead at all, only a gap in the stars, and then the lights would return, a little farther on, as though the thing had taken a single step through the dark. And the silence, which is the detail that does the most quiet work. A shape that size, moving that low, ought to have announced itself a mile off, the drone of engines, the beat of rotors, the pressure of moving air. Witness after witness reached instead for the absence of all that. No sound, no wind. A thing as big as a stadium sliding overhead with less noise than the car they were sitting in. Most people saw it from a distance, a shape crossing the far sky. A smaller number had it come to them. The account that stayed with the valley longest belonged to a man named Dennis Sant, who worked for the county and lived in Brewster, near the interstate. One night in the middle of March, 1983, he stepped outside his own home and found the air above the house taken up by something he could only call a city of lights, vast and close and silent, hanging over his own roof while his family stood in the yard and looked up at it. It held there above them, unhurried, and then it drifted off the way all the rest had. He was not a man with a story to sell. He simply had, from that night forward, something he had seen over his own home, in front of his own children, that he was never able to make smaller. A few witnesses described more than a shape and its lights. They described a beam, a shaft of pale light that lowered from the underside of the thing and slid across the ground, across a road toward a stopped car as though it were searching or looking at someone in particular. The people it reached reported no heat and no sound, only the light resting on them for a moment, and then its slow withdrawal back up into the dark mass overhead. None of them, distant or close, could finally say what they had seen. They were not frightened the way a horror story frightens. They were unsettled in a quieter way, left holding something that would not fit the world they thought they lived in. A distant light can be argued away by morning. It is a good deal harder to talk a man out of the night a city of light stood over his own house in front of his own family and never made a sound. A wave that large draws people who want to make sense of it. Two in particular came to the Hudson Valley with notebooks, and one of them had spent his whole life learning how to look. The local man was Philip Imbrogno, a science teacher who began collecting accounts as the reports multiplied, driving out to meet the people who had called in, sitting at their kitchen tables, writing down what they said before the retelling could smooth it over. He gathered hundreds of accounts, and the sheer volume of them from people with nothing to gain was its own kind of evidence. The other man was J. Allen Hynek, and to understand why his interest mattered, you have to know where he had come from. For more than 20 years, Hynek had been the United States Air Force's own astronomer on the question of flying saucers, the scientific consultant to the projects that cataloged the reports, the long-running last of which was called Blue Book. He had taken the job in the beginning as a skeptic, and a useful one. His task was to explain the sightings away, and most of them he could. A misjudged planet, a weather balloon, a flight of birds lit from below, the bright star that fooled an honest pilot. He was the man the Air Force put forward to say, calmly and with credentials, that there was nothing in the sky worth losing sleep over. What changed him was the residue. After 20 years and thousands of cases, a stubborn fraction would not resolve. Reports from sober, qualified witnesses that no ordinary explanation could cover. Hynek was too careful a scientist to call them spacecraft, and too honest a one to keep calling them nothing. By the time the Air Force closed Blue Book, the man hired to debunk the phenomenon had become its most credible investigator, the one who coined the very phrase close encounter, and who founded a center to study the reports the government had stopped collecting. So when Hynek turned his attention north of New York City near the end of his life, he did not come as a believer working a crowd. He came as what 20 years had made him, a careful man, hard to impress, who had read more of these accounts than almost anyone alive, and who said of the Hudson Valley only the smallest and most unsettling thing he could honestly say, that a great many credible people were describing the same specific object in one place over and over, and that the easy answers did not cover it. The work the two of them did with the writer Bob Pratt became a book called Night Siege, published in 1987. Hynek did not live to see it. He died in the spring of 1986, the year before it reached print. His last major investigation, a wave of lights over a valley he could not finally explain. He left the case where he had left so many others, not solved, not dismissed, held instead at the careful open distance of a man who had learned across a long career exactly how much it costs to be certain too soon. There is an ordinary explanation for the shape over the parkway, and it deserves to be told plainly and given its due because a good deal of it is almost certainly true. Not far from the heart of the sighting area sat a small airfield at Stormville, and out of it flew a loose club of private pilots. By several accounts, a handful of them, 5 or 6, took to going up at night and flying their light planes in tight formation, wingtip to wingtip, with colored bulbs strung along the aircraft and the undersides darkened, so the planes themselves disappeared against the night. From the ground, the separate lights merged into one solid shape. The pilots would shift their arrangement in the air, a line becoming a V becoming a cross, and the great object overhead would seem to change form. And when they switched their lights off together, on a count, the thing would appear to blink clean out of existence. It is a genuinely good explanation, and it explains a great deal: the boomerang outline, the colored lights, the way the shape seemed to change, the vanishings, and the fact that the sightings clustered exactly where a small airfield's hobby pilots would be flying. Police pointed to these flights, and skeptical writers tracked them down. One of them, the investigator Brian Dunning, made a fair point in the pilot's defense. There is little real sign they ever set out to fool anyone. They were flying for the pleasure of it, formation flying being its own difficult art. The hoax, if it even deserves the word, was something the valley partly did to itself, a string of harmless lights over a nervous county read by frightened people as a single enormous craft. When the pilots saw the newspapers, the story goes, they were first astonished and then quietly delighted at what the county had made of them. For a large share of the Hudson Valley sightings, that is very likely the whole of it. Small planes, a dark sky, a willing imagination doing the rest. It is the explanation a careful person should reach for first and hold longest, and it would be a poor sort of honesty that hurried past it to get to the stranger thing underneath. The trouble with the planes is not that they are wrong. It is that they do not reach all the way to the edges of what people described. Start with the silence, since it is the stone in the shoe of the whole explanation. A formation of small aircraft, flying low enough to be mistaken for one craft a few hundred feet up, is not quiet. It is a chorus of engines, a sound the people underneath would have heard plainly, the way you hear a single small plane cross a summer afternoon from a mile off. One pilot, a man with thousands of hours of formation flying behind him, read the hoax explanation and called it worthless on exactly this point. A cluster of light planes creeping along that slowly, he said, would have sounded like a row of lawn mowers in the sky, and what the witnesses kept reporting over and over was no sound at all. Then the hovering. Light planes cannot stop. To stay in the air, they must keep moving, and faster than a walking pace. They cannot hang motionless over a parkway or stand for a quarter of an hour above a nuclear plant. Yet that stillness is in account after account, the thing pausing, holding, waiting over a house or a car before it slid away. Then the size. 5 or 6 small aircraft in formation make a loose, ragged cluster, not a solid mass with edges. They do not blot out the stars between 2 ridgelines, and they do not lower a beam of light onto a road. And then the simplest problem of all. There were nights when the lights came and the little airfield's planes were on the ground, when the people who flew the formation were not flying, and the shape crossed the valley anyway. None of these, taken alone, quite breaks the explanation. A sound can be missed. A size can be misjudged in the dark. But laid side by side, they leave a residue the planes cannot absorb, a portion of the wave that stays strange after the ordinary answer has done all the honest work it can do. Most of it was probably planes, and a stubborn remainder is neither solved nor solvable, sitting in the open middle where the most careful investigators chose to leave it, and where it sits still. A case like this one tends to leave a second mystery behind once the first has been argued to a standstill. Set the planes aside, hold the explained up against the part that stays strange, and a different question begins to surface. Not what the thing was, but where it kept choosing to appear. Because the wave did not fall evenly across the map. It pooled. When you set the sightings down on paper and looked at where the thing chose to linger, a pattern came up out of the noise, not of who saw it, but of what it seemed to come for. It came back to water. The reservoirs that fed the city drew it again and again, the great dark sheets of held water in the hills, ringed by woods, quiet as the surface of nothing. Witnesses near them reported the object low over the water, holding there sometimes for minutes at a time. The broad Hudson running south to the sea seemed to mark a road it followed. It returned to power. One summer, guards at the Indian Point nuclear plant on the eastern bank of the river reported that one of the objects came and stood above the reactors and held there a quarter of an hour before it moved on. Others described the lights pacing the high-tension lines, drifting along the steel towers that carry current down out of the hills. None of this proved anything, and the careful investigators said so. But the Hudson Valley is not the only place that pulls the strange toward it this way. There is a town on the Ohio River, Point Pleasant, that filled a single strange year with a winged figure and lights and visitors no one could name. Out in the Utah desert in Skinwalker country, a single ranch has handed the same impossible reports down through one family for generations. And across the ocean, in a Norwegian valley called Hestelen, lights have risen out of the ground and hung in the air for decades, watched now by instruments that still cannot say what they are. Different countries, different centuries, the same shape of story returning to a few quiet addresses. The man who gave these places their name spent a famous winter inside one. In 1966 and 67, the writer John Keel went to Point Pleasant to chase the winged figure the local papers were calling Mothman, and stayed to find the whole town humming with strangeness, lights in the sky, telephone calls that should not have been possible, men in dark suits asking odd questions at odd hours. Keel came to believe the Mothman was never really the point. The point was the place. Certain patches of ground, he decided, behaved like lightning rods for strange events, drawing sightings and coincidences and visitors the way a valley draws fog. He called them window areas, spots where the curtain between the ordinary world and whatever lies behind it hangs a little looser so that things slip through in one town and never in the next. The beings that came through he refused to call aliens. He called them ultra-terrestrials, and the dark-suited men who followed them, the men in black. It is an idea to hold lightly, and we will. Name enough special places and you can draw a line through anything. But the pattern is real enough that careful people kept noticing it, and it turns one mystery into two. The first is the thing in the sky, the shape, the lights, the silence. The second is the ground underneath it. Why this valley? Why these reservoirs and ridges? Why the strangeness keeps choosing the same few quiet places and leaving the rest of the map alone? By that reading, the Hudson Valley is not only the site of a wave, it is one of the windows. And a window, by its nature, can open more than once. The wave did not end so much as thin. The great nights of the early 80s gave way to quieter years, a scattering of reports through the rest of the decade, the occasional account drifting in long after the cameras and the reporters had gone. Slowly, the valley went back to being a valley. But it did not go back entirely because the people who saw it were changed in small, permanent ways. Some of them became quietly watchers of the sky, people who had never once looked up before and now did, every clear night, out of a habit the valley had taught them. Families rearranged the smallest things. A porch light left off so the dark would be readable, a particular window kept clear, a stretch of reservoir road a teenager learned to slow down on. None of it was supernatural. It was only what people do after the world has shown them an edge they did not know it had. They keep an eye on the place the edge appeared. And they kept the story straight. Asked again, decades on, the witnesses give the same few details and have spent their lives declining to make them larger. Stranger still, many of them came to remember the silence more clearly than the lights. As the years wore the memories down, it was the colors that faded first. Late in life, some could no longer say for certain whether the lights had run red to green or green to white. But not one of them forgot the wrongness of a thing that vast moving overhead and making no sound at all. The lights were what they saw. The silence was what stayed. Those roads are still there. Somewhere tonight, a commuter will drive north on the Taconic, beneath the same ridges, after a long day in the city. The reservoirs will lie black behind their dams in the winter dark. The stars will hang over the valley the way they always have. And for a moment, perhaps, that driver will glance upward, half expecting the stars to go out behind something wide and quiet and slow. Whatever passed over those 3 counties has not been caught and has not been explained in a way that satisfies everyone who stood in the cold and watched it. The windows are like that. They open and the strangeness pools in them for a while, and then it recedes, and the place is left holding the story the way a field holds the shape of something heavy that rested there once through a long night and was gone before the morning came.